County Galway, was the home of Lady Augusta Gregory, a 45-year-old widow whose interest in Irish folk tales had been inflamed by a reading of the Celtic Twilight.
He used to spend quite a long time in the west of Ireland with Lady Gregory, who had a house and land, Cool Park, and she used to make him welcome and he used to stay with her for quite long periods.
I doubt if I should have done much with my life, but for her firmness and her care. If that influence were lacking, Ireland would be greatly impoverished. So much has been planned out in the library or among the woods at Cool. We work to add dignity to Ireland, was a favourite phrase of hers.
In 1898, Yeats and Lady Gregory secured Edward Martyn's financial and literary help for the first production of the Irish theatre. A handful of playwrights, bent upon a national theatre, was joined by a group of actors with the same goal. The plays that were written for a small playhouse in a small country have since been presented throughout the world. The effect upon the leading participants was overwhelming. Lady Gregory revealed a considerable talent for comedy. John M. Synge suddenly built a fantastic drama out of Irish life. The subject matter had to be Irish, and Irish in a self-respecting sense. The stage Irishman was banished. Yeats indefatigably attended rehearsals, talked with actors, and tried to work out a new theory for the speaking of verse.
All through the 90s, as he tried to further the possibility of a national theater and to get his poetry recited, he didn't want the poet to ever go into exile in the country. It was crucial for him that the poet do everything to move to the center of his culture. He had to bring the living voice to a public that didn't have the art of reading, but that had the art of listening.
But the old attraction for Maud Gonne continued. They met often in Dublin, and he could not stop loving her. She, on her part, gave little inkling of much of her character. He thought she would never marry anyone, but would devote her life to the salvation of Ireland, and on that theme, he wrote Kathleen Ní Shúile in 1902 for her to act. His obsession for Maud Gonne remained, and now began to threaten Yeats's health. For mental or physical reasons, he was frequently near the breaking point.
It was a time of great personal strain and sorrow. I was tortured by sexual desire and disappointed love. Often, as I walked in the woods at Cool, it would have been a relief to have screamed aloud.
One night in February 1903, he went to give a lecture, and just before he was about to speak, he was handed a letter in her familiar handwriting. Maud Gonne wrote, however, an unfamiliar message. She had just married Major John MacBride in Paris.
Some may have blamed you that you took away the verses that could move them on the day when, the ears being deafened, the sight of the eyes blind with lightning, you went from me. And I could find nothing to make a song about but kings, helmets and swords and half-forgotten things that were like memories of you. But now we'll out, for the world lives as long ago. And while we're in our laughing, weeping fit, hurl helmets, crowns and swords into the pit. But dear, cling close to me. Since you were gone, My barren thoughts have chilled me to the bone.
Yeats was 37 years old, half of his life over. What would he do now that his most cherished dream was gone? Yeats now decided to leave Dublin, and in November of 1903, he set sail for America on a lecture tour. The trip obviously afforded him an occasion to reconsider his way of life. On his return, people noticed a change in him. He was externalized. He moves from the twilight to the cold of dawn before the sun appears. Yeats was looking for something to think about, besides his disappointment in love. Into the dozen or so fairly important quarrels in the Irish theatre movement, from 1903 until 1911, he threw himself with something like abandon. He became a terrible man in combat, who could compel by sheer force of personality, or as he would have put it, by power of his mask, a jeering crowd into silence. Behind the scenes, he compromised a great deal, but at the footlights, he was inflexible.
I think, yes, my father was a fighter. Very much so. All his life he fought for causes in which he believed and fought very strongly when necessary. The first big public representation of this perhaps was the riots at the Abbey Theatre over scenes played by the Western world in 1907, when over several nights in a row the audience rioted against the play that they disapproved of, and my father came out on the stage and downfaced the audience in what seems to be the most remarkable speech, which made an indelible impression on everyone who was there.
My curse on plays that have to be set up in 50 ways, on the day's war with every knave and dolt, theatre business, management of men.
All the time this was going on, or a good deal of the time in the early days, father was the manager. He was the one who had to, or thought he had to, engage the actors and see that the money was counted at the end of the day and that the accounts hung together. And I have no doubt he interfered in every moment in the production of plays, in the lighting, in everything. He wouldn't leave a thing alone. That's the way, of course, to get things done. But he certainly had his finger in every pie in the Abbey. There's no doubt about that.
Yeats's poetry now began to change. Instead of being cries of loss, his poems became debates with himself.
All things can tempt me from this craft of verse. One time it was a woman's face, or worse, the seeming needs of my fool-driven land. Now nothing but comes readier to the hand than this accustomed toil.
He had signal assistance from Ezra Pound, who set himself the task of converting Yeats to the modern movement. Uncle William, as he called him, was making good progress, but still dragging some of the reeds of the 90s in his hair. Yeats had reached that point where the poet, having freed himself from other people's language, can create his own.
He was certain, I think, from the moment at which he realized that he was not merely the sum of his attributes, that he could in fact transform himself, that he could in that respect be the great modern and the great romantic poet. Because this was part of Romanticism. It's part of the whole theory of the imagination, that you are not just the sum of your qualities. You can be the product of your qualities, that the imagination is, after all, the imagination is your mind in the aspect of its freedom. And that freedom is the freedom of self-creation, self-definition, that you're not merely the result of your parents. That in that sense, I think he did feel that he was indeed a great modern artist, and how right he was.
What need you, being come to sense, but fumble in a greasy till and add the halfpence to the pence and prayer to shivering prayer until you have dried the marrow from the bone. For men were born to pray and save. Romantic Ireland's dead and gone, it's with O'Leary in the grave. Was it for this the wild geese spread the grey wing upon every tide? For this that all that blood was shed? For this Edward Fitzgerald died, and Robert Emmet and Wolfe Tone, all that delirium of the brave? Romantic Ireland's dead and gone, it's with O'Leary in the grave.
It would seem now that the dramatic Easter Rising in 1916 was a direct answer to Yeats's challenge. This was not so. Irish history reached its crisis without Yeats's knowledge. He was in England, staying with the painter William Rothenstein, who reported that the poet fretted somewhat that he had not been consulted, had been left in ignorance of what was afoot.
Romantic Ireland's dead and gone sounds old-fashioned now. It seemed true in 1913, but I did not foresee 1916.
At first, Yeats had been indignant with the Dublin rebels for needlessly sacrificing their lives. But gradually, their deaths became ennobled in his mind. All had seemed to him ordinary people, but they had suddenly found their heroic opposites. On September the 25th, 1916, he wrote their eulogy.
Too long a sacrifice can make a stone of the heart. Oh, when may it suffice? That is heaven's part. Our part to murmur name upon name, as a mother names her child when sleep at last has come on limbs that had run wild. What is it but nightfall? No, no, not night, but death. Was it needless death after all? For England may keep faith for all that is done and said. We know their dream, enough to know they dreamed and are dead. And what if excess of love bewildered them till they died? I write it out in a verse. MacDonough and MacBride and Connolly and Pearce, now and in time to be, wherever green is worn, are changed, changed utterly. A terrible beauty is born.